Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet,
Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
As a heads up, there will not be an episode next week, as we will be just getting back from Nashville. Be sure to tune in for our live stream on Facebook on Sunday, August 20th. Please feel free to submit topics of conversation, queries, and general comments to us on Facebook and Twitter, either during or before the Ad Astra Eclipse Road Trip live stream.
And as always, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, sign up for emails, do all of that. Rate us on iTunes, you know the drill. And today we are going to be talking about a few listener-submitted topics regarding Mars and the future of NASA's planetary science programs. In latest from Washington, we're going to cover more on our continuing coverage of Space Corps. In the Space News Highlight of the Week, we're going to be talking about SpaceX's Falcon Heavy launching in November. In international news, we'll talk about Nano Avionics, a Lithuanian nano spacecraft company who has some big news coming up. And in latest in tech, we'll be talking about launching a supercomputer into space and Virgin Orbit getting a new smallsat contract. But first, Jack, how would you like to introduce our guest?
Well, our guest is the wonderful, illustrious, insanely intelligent Casey Dreier of the Planetary Society. Casey?
Hey guys, I wish I could be introduced like that pretty much every day. Thanks, Jay. That's very nice of you. Happy to be here.
Welcome to the podcast, Casey.
Well, thank you very much, Newton.
So, Casey, what is your position at the Planetary Society?
So I'm the director of space policy. So I run our kind of both policy and advocacy efforts at the organization, developing new ideas and analyses, independent information to help people understand the movements behind policy in Washington, D.C. for NASA primarily and space science. And we also try to organize our members into becoming politically active citizens who can help engage with and alter the future of, for the better, space exploration in the United States and beyond.
And how does one get involved in that?
Oh, well, I'm so glad you asked. They can go right to planetary.org/membership if you want to become a member. So at Planetary Society, it's a nonprofit organization supported pretty much exclusively by small donors. We have about 50,000 members across the world who provide the functional operation funding basically for the entire organization. Very few other places out there like that. And that really gives us an independence to say what we think, follow the causes that our members support, and to really try to represent the public's voice, both in policy and in the broader circle kind of beyond that in terms of on the internet, or to promote interest in space to a broad audience. So it's planetary.org/membership, $4 a month. It's a deal. Or you can give more money. I won't stop you. On top of that, but it's a donor-based organization and very proud to be that.
Yeah, I mean, I think our listeners are very well aware of just how awesome Planetary is. I think, Newton, you and I talk about just how awesome the local chapter is in DC, but just overall the wonderful things that the Planetary Society has done for the community and continues to provide for the community.
And I was going to say, make sure you tell folks how to get in touch with the local Planetary Society down here in DC, Jack. What's our Facebook page?
The Facebook page is Planetary Society of Washington, D.C. The Twitter is DC Planetary. We have a Facebook group called DC Planetary as well. And then my email is just first.lastname@planetary.org, and I'll get you set up with all of the membership stuff and links and everything you could ask for. No more eclipse glasses, though. We unfortunately ran out of those.
It's a hot seller right now. Yeah, it seems
they really are.
And I should just jump in and compliment you, Jack, with the great work that you've done running the Planetary Society's DC volunteer operation. You've really revitalized that group, and always fun to see you when I'm in town, and really great to see what you built there with other members in the area.
Well, thank you. So I guess, that leads us sort of into our first topic, something about planetary science, Mars. So a friend of mine messaged me on Facebook the other day, and my friend Robert Brockmeijer, and he asked, why do people think it would be easier to colonize Mars than to fix Earth? So, I mean, it goes back to that why Mars question. And I think, I mean, for me, from what I've experienced and learned and seen in the community, is that Mars has always been that next step, right? In this, I mean, it even harkens back to that von Braun paradigm. Werner von Braun, when he came to the U.S. after being, I guess, captured or saved from the Nazis during the Second World War, helped build the Saturn V, but also really built the organizational structure that NASA would work under for the better part of 2 decades, and also created this culture around himself and the space program of, we went from, in 1913, from having like the first biplanes utilized in combat and transportation to 50, 60 years later, humans walking on the moon. Imagine what can be accomplished in those next 50 to 60 years. So I guess that's at least where I see this whole why Mars coming from. But I'd be interested to see, Casey, what your take on this why Mars question is.
Absolutely, and I think it's a really interesting question in just even how it's posed, the dichotomy of it, right? That it's an either or structure, and it's, your friend said this, I've heard it many times, and very prominent people write about this. I think there was a New Yorker piece about this not even a year ago, talking about it's kind of a larger conversation about sending humans to Mars. Usually is when this comes up. And then you have these counter think pieces come out and say, what about Earth, or why Mars instead of Earth? And this interesting phrasing here of, I think of like, why does this keep coming up? As you kind of touch on, I think it's a couple of things. One, I think, again, I kind of touch on is the people always phrase it as an either or, as a dichotomy. And I just flat out, when I start to talk with someone about this, I just reject that as the construct of that question. I don't think the question is set up to be a fair question, right? Whether knowingly or subconsciously, phrasing the question in that way sets it up as it's almost like slightly aggressive, not quite an attack, but framing it in a way that where they're coming from already. Like, by asking it that way, you basically understand what their opinion is to begin with. And I think the idea is that Mars tends to be seen, and to even more broadly, just as a step towards the future, right? And so it's always easier to project ways to fix something that doesn't exist. And we all have kind of mental models in our head about the world around us, right? That's how our brains work. We have these, intuitive physical structures in our heads about modeling the world and how we engage with it. It's a lot easier to make a very simplistic model about things that don't exist, right? It's always way easier when you have that luxury. And then when you are working with something that doesn't exist, you can ignore the complexities or the unpleasantness of a bunch of people in the same room together arguing about anything, right? Trying to fix Earth now is that's just a huge, broad question. And B, you have to then also acknowledge the opposite of that, all the gritty details and histories and irrationalities and human nature that comes into what we know to be here now because we see it every day. And so I guess that in the broad sense, we talk about Mars, I think, because of that von Braun style futurism, optimism, look what we can do if we put our minds to it, and maybe this time we won't bring it with us. I think we will, but I think that's where part of that comes from. The other side of it is, why do people ask that question? I feel like that's a deeper problem of, first, I think people not fully understanding the relative resource allocation that we currently put towards space exploration versus literally trying to fix the problems at home, right? It's not even comparable within a few orders of magnitude. And the other one being, I think, seeing it as a rejection of acknowledging the problems, perhaps. So people feel problems, they feel very strongly about them. And you're talking about Mars. That is in itself, how could you ignore what I see to be very deep issues facing us? And that's where I think we can just step around this whole question by saying it doesn't have to be either or, right? You can chew gum and walk at the same time, or a title of Bill Nye's new book, Everything All at Once. And I really like that phrase. Yeah. We don't have a luxury, in a sense, of doing one or another, right? We don't have the luxury of choosing one thing to fix, or to even acknowledge that there's one thing to fix when we could put everything else off. Humans, particularly humans in the 21st century, are, I think, in a sense, it's a blessing and a curse situation where we have an immense set of technical, societal capabilities that we didn't previously have. And at the same, so along with those comes the expectation that we should turn our better angels of our natures loose on our own, culture or on population to help improve it. Like even that idea didn't really exist a few hundred years ago, honestly, right? And then at the same time, not all of us have to do this, but I think a few of us should be thinking about where to go in space, or how to change the future, or how to search advance humanity's scientific knowledge of the universe. I think those are both aptly and utterly capable of happening at the same time.
Absolutely.
So that's my general response. You can see that that's my elevator, 5-minute long ranty elevator pitch.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of had the same reaction to it that I did. Well, first, for starters, I'm not sure if people actually do think that it's easier to colonize Mars than to fix Earth. I actually tried to hunt down some polls or surveys on this, and I didn't actually see anything, at least nothing scientific. But going back to the question being posed as sort of this either or thing, you can't just say that we should wait until we solve all of these other problems before addressing this problem. This is something that's always a question that's brought up when we talk about funding for a lot of different space programs, right? And in many ways, working both of these things in parallel, working for this one specific topic, colonizing Mars, as well as addressing problems on Earth, climate change problems on Earth, working both in parallel helps one to solve another's problem. You're working with in some sense a sample of n equals 2 climates as opposed to 1 if you're working on both. You're working on you're seeing things about Mars's climate that you can then relate to Earth's climate from a scientific standpoint. You don't have to focus on one specific thing, especially when the funds for, let's say, NASA Earth Sciences, NOAA, EPA, DOE, etc., probably aren't getting appropriated over to Mars colonization when they get ripped out of those organizations, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's a couple of thought fallacies there, right? Where is the money currently going into those programs the only reason these other issues are not being addressed from a resources standpoint? And as you point out, no. The answer is no. The money that is not the reason. And another thing, too, that kind of struck me about what you were just saying was this idea that, the n equals 2, don't forget how we started to think about global warming was from the comparative planetology first provided to us by the Mariner probes going to Venus and to Mars, right?
Yep.
And we saw the edge cases of 2 very bad outcomes that could happen to a climate, becoming a acid rain, hellish CO2 choked, oven of Venus, or becoming this dry desert wasteland that never peaks above like 20 degrees.
Right. It was a warning. Don't let this happen to your planet.
Yeah. So we're bounded by these 2 bad climate cases, right? So that should be a thing. But also, I think, honestly, really, when it comes down to it, the other thing is that I think it's actually way easier to get to Mars, particularly with people, or particularly with robots, we know that for sure, but definitely even with people, than it is to fix some of these big problems. I think because
absolutely.
right? Because Mars, fundamentally, what we're talking about with space, generally it becomes technical. You have a mix of it's like technical problems, which generally we assume can be solved at some or at least
engineering problems.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
And then the other problem generally is just a lack of monetary resources, and that's not a hard problem to solve. It's a hard problem to solve practically. It's an easy problem to solve theoretically, right? Just more money.
Right. Yeah.
That's the answer to it.
Insert money.
But everything is easier with more money, right?
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I think that the theoretical solution to, let's say, poverty is not as clear cut, right? Even with is it just money? Is there, you have a huge amounts of research going into this, or education, or inequality, or a variety of things that afflict humanity, or even just resentment and fear of the unknown, right? I mean, we're fighting some ancient evolutionary demons every time we go outside into the street, and we need to, that's an ongoing process that has no easy answer to it, because we would have hit the easy answers by now, or there's some very deep political, historical context that makes a straightforward approach very difficult, if that makes sense. So Mars, in the sense of, we just need the money and resources to build the stuff and then get there, that's relatively straightforward. And it's the fighting for those resources that tends to be where most of this effort is expelled.
But you don't have to deal with as many people on the way as you do when you're trying to address problems for climate change, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely true. Yep.
Yeah. There's just not as many political hurdles to get over in that case, whereas you have to have administrations that are willing to address the certain problems when it comes to climate change. And
I was reading a book recently. So you may have talked about in your show already that the National Space Council is back, and we have our executive secretary, who you know well, Dr. Scott Pace. And I was reading a book called Falling Back to Earth by Mark Albrecht, who was the previous National Space Council's executive secretary back in '89 for George H.W. Bush. And it's kind of just a remarkable time capsule of the moment. He talked about, so on '89 and in that summer, July, George H.W. Bush, on the 20th anniversary of Apollo 11, announced a big effort, say we're going to return to the moon and go on to Mars, the Space Exploration Initiative, right, the SEI. And through a variety of reasons why politics is unpleasant, the price, a rough price tag of $500 billion came out, and dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Congress. But at the same time, I remember there's Mark Albrecht writes about this scene that he recalls seeing of the president doing an address, a whole space conference on the Hill with the top leadership of the relevant congressional committees, and the ranking member at the time, but a Republican of, I believe it was in the House committee, and I believe it was appropriations, basically went up and did a kind of a soapbox and saying, human space flight is just a waste of money. The only practical value that we get from space that is worthy of taxpayer investment is climate research and monitoring and the Environmental Protection Agency in helping do that. That is the only practical consequence. And this is a Republican grandstanding on that against human space.
And what bizarro world were you living in when this happened?
Yeah, this is the year of 1989, right? History is affirming. Yeah. And it shows you how previously innocuous concepts, like the fact that the climate is changing, can be politicized very rapidly given the right conditions. So I wonder, should Mars ever become a massive focus of government resources, perhaps then you would see some marshaling against it, or maybe then it would become politicized once people really feel its sting.
we talked about this on the last episode. Can we ever sort of get behind anything like unified as a country, sort of like we did with Apollo? Granted, Apollo had a number of different conditions behind it, but that's a great question. Will Mars end up being politicized? And my thought is that it might. But
yeah, I mean, especially with this administration, sort of with all that, it's all about context, right? So there's all this that's going on. We have Charlottesville, we have everything going on just around the country, and the administration is, they have to do a million jobs every day. They're working on a million issues every day, and they've taken space, or at least the vice president has taken space as sort of his baby. Like he wants to bring back, he brought back the National Space Council. They seem to be getting active now as the summer comes to a close. I read this thing that 4 of the 67 bills signed by the president in the first 200 days have dealt with space or science, which to me seems like extremely high. And this is discounting all of the bills that are, innocuous, not relevant, or not very important, not very consequential. So 4 of 60 something bills have to do with space. So we're living in a world where the administration is hyper politicized and they're taking on space. Does that put us in a place where space could be at risk in the Congress? I definitely think so. But I also think we're in this place where our access to space, our assets in space, both in orbit and on other worlds, are almost taken for granted. And the society has put out this white paper called Mars in Retrograde. Right, Casey? Is that the correct title?
It is indeed the title, yeah.
That, from my understanding, it talks about just the almost not unifying action that towards space exploration, but the unified inaction towards following up to previous successes. So if you want to give a little spiel about the white paper,
I'd love to
extrapolate on that.
I'd love to, and I wanted to address your first point first, though. I think that's a really important point you make, and the issue of will things become partisan? And there's actually a really interesting book that came out about this called Beyond Ideology by Francis Lee. And I read this and I wrote a whole piece about this on planetary.org a couple years ago, and it didn't really quite make the impression I hoped, because it's hard to let go, and particularly hard in the space community, where we have a really high reverence for, or at least a picture of, the role of presidential and the White House leadership in space activities, so tightly connected to John F. Kennedy, the moonshot, and we almost I think a lot of people in space, or space fans, think, oh, if only a president came down, made a big speech, and then, said we're going to go back to the moon, and followed up with the money. That's all it would take, and then we'd be on the way again. Or we just need some kind of unifying moment that John F. Kennedy had for us. And I mean, we know that that's a simplistic view of it, but fundamentally, that paradigm, even, I think, and I argued this in my piece, just doesn't exist anymore. If a president, in this country, at least, the politics have become so partisan that the president is the de facto leader of their political party more than the nation, at least as seen by good portions of the other political parties used most of the time, if not more people than that.
And so culturally, it's harder to break away from that political party as well.
Right, yeah. And so when you call for something, it then becomes by association tied to your party. And because then Frances Lee points this out in her book, and she did research on this, that because Congress in particular has become so tenuously held by both parties, each party kind of believes that they have a good shot at taking back Congress every couple of years. So that means you really should not be compromising with your political opponents, because why would you help them out to give them a win when you could wait it off a couple of years and define yourself against them and then run on what you are different than the existing party, right? And you've basically seen this pretty clearly, particularly in the last 10 years, but even stretching on beyond that. And she actually did some analysis of presidential priorities as expressed in their State of the Union addresses and how likely they were to be partisan or politicized after that. And she found a correlation between the more a president talks about an issue in their State of the Union, particularly issues that didn't have a strong ideological bent beforehand, the more they tended to become partisan on the lines because of the president themselves showed favor to it. So this makes me nervous when you have right now a relatively unpopular presidential administration. If they embrace space too much, or, I think you will run the risk of it being politicized against them merely for being associated with them, and it gets lumped into the partisanship of everything else.
Right. That's a big problem for space in general, because space is supposed to span multiple administrations. These missions, all of these things that we're doing. We're seeing it with, not to jump ahead, the Mars program, and we've seen it before with the way that the shuttle program was dealt with. These are programs that are supposed to span administrations, and if one administration's viewpoint is wildly different from the other, it could end up resulting in a lot of wasted tax dollars at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing already. We've been seeing that with the human spaceflight program, ping-ponging back and forth between Moon, Mars.
Yeah, absolutely.
for a while.
Absolutely.
Asteroid, don't forget asteroid.
Yeah. Sorry, the what retrieval mission? Yeah, exactly, right?
Which, I think that's a perfect case study for what you're talking about, of a president jumping behind something in human space exploration, and it becoming becoming a hyper partisan issue. We saw that with the Obama administration with ARM, and I think we sort of saw that with SCI, and even throughout. Back through Reagan and the Space Station Freedom, which was what it was called before it was the ISS. You were talking about a good book you read. I read Spaceflight and the Myth of Presidential Leadership by Roger Launius and Howard McCurdy. Also a great book. It's more of an anthology of a bunch of other authors writing, talking about how our perception is that a Kennedy moment is what is required to kickstart human spaceflight endeavor, when really it's more in the congressional cultural sphere than it is in the presidential sphere.
Yeah, and I think you really need them all firing in sync, which is probably why it happens so rarely. You need, particularly with space, you need some big external event to unite kind of your internal factions. And, this isn't just with space, this is with any political thing. And I think that's when space became useful for, particularly with national security, and particularly in something as existentially threatening as the Cold War, you had, blank check, and you could do whatever you want. And you happened, you had a variety of very unique circumstances with that. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, the fact that his vice president was a huge fan of space, right? And then by the time it spanned 3 administrations, the whole moon program, because then by the time they all landed, it was Nixon, and he wasn't about to cancel it right when he needed to get his name on the moon a couple of times. But then after that, he was pretty much done with it, right? As you well know, he just walked away from that whole thing. And the issue, I think, and space again has been mercifully free of this, relative to many other issues in government. And that is generally, I think, because it plays a pretty small role in domestic affairs. And I think, again, it's not a bad thing fundamentally to have a White House that is interested in space. That can be really good, but they have to, be aware of that if they want to be successful in the long term. And the Obama White House did not learn this lesson, or did not do this lesson well. You need to build a broader coalition behind it. And I think you need to have it be big enough and with enough people bought into it to make it sustainable beyond just you as the administration. And I think a good counterexample would be the commercial space flight investments to commercial cargo and commercial crew. And those struggled to get their funding requests for years, until they basically became successful enough in their own right and started spreading their money around and opening places in different states and so forth, that now it's unquestioned. And that was definitely an Obama era that was one of the most important policy decisions in space that we've had in decades, I would say. And it happened under Obama, and it's continuing under the Trump administration. And I think that was a really good example of how you build a coalition that can span this sort of policy investment or policy support beyond a single administration. ARM was different than that. It was small and never really got going, definitely tied to that administration, and never built a large community of people who were really supportive of it. And lo and behold, switch administrations, had no support, and it was the first thing to go. And no one, as far as I can tell, no one is really upset about it. Very few people are very upset about it.
I think there might be like 3 or 4 early solar system scientists who were very upset about it, but I think they've moved on to other things.
I mainly feel bad for the program managers and other, civil servants at NASA and places who spent years of their lives working on this, knowing it was probably a doomed mission.
Right.
That's a tough position to be in.
Yeah.
I guess maybe.
Oh, should I plug my my thing now? All right, let me.
I think it's time to plug the Mars and Retrograde paper. It's a great paper.
Yeah, it is a good. Well, thank you. I think it is a good paper. And it's on planetary.org under the space advocate section of our website. You can read it there. We wrote it to be readable by a broad audience. And we really tried to look at a fundamental problem. And this is kind of a different problem in space beyond the kind of the political level, because Mars isn't, so we're talking about the robotic Mars program. And while it's the most successful robotic Mars endeavor in human history, and has spent billions of dollars over decades, it is a relatively small program in the scope of the federal government. We're talking no more than like 4% or so of NASA's entire budget per year, ever in its history. And where we are, so what we have is a slightly different problem. You had actually quite a big burst of support for this robotic exploration of Mars beginning in the mid 90s, kind of ramping up in early George W. Bush administration, and has been kind of pulling back ever since. And the insidious problem that afflicts all projects, public or private, honestly, is not so much the building it up part, right? We're good at building things, building programs, building bridges, building whatever. The hard part is upkeep and maintenance. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. It doesn't sound as exciting. But if you're riding your subway every day, you will notice after a while if they don't do the required maintenance and upkeep to keep the thing running. And that's
so anybody that rides the metro.
Yes, let's say in DC, if you start seeing flames coming out of the metro, yes, you'll
right. DC Metro, New York City Metro, and a variety. Right? It's you pay for that stuff eventually, and it's hard because again, it's boring. It tends to be more boring than building the new stuff is the good maintenance, and we're kind of at a similar place in that with the robotic Mars program at NASA, in the sense that we have built an incredible infrastructure at the Red Planet that supports exploration of Mars with a robotic exploration. And it would be useful, obviously, with people should we get to that point. But even now, and what it comes down to is basically communications. And if you think about let's say Curiosity on the surface of Mars. Curiosity every day, it has over a dozen cameras. It has 8 science, probably about a dozen science instruments, all collecting data. You have very complex amounts of data being generated. Engineering data is being generated about the health and safety of the rover. And while the rover has an antenna that can talk to Earth directly, it is a tiny antenna, right? And don't forget, the entire power source of the Curiosity rover is only 100 watts. That's a couple of light bulbs is the amount of power available to you at any moment. So even if you built some really large transmitter, you would never have that much power to transmit back to Earth.
Right.
And so the average data rate back to Earth from Curiosity is on average is about a kilobit per second. Depending on how far Mars is away, it can change a little bit, but on average about a kilobit per second. So if you're generating, and Curiosity generates hundreds of megabits of data per day, usually more than that. So if you just use that rover's antenna, you would never get the data back from Mars. Why even go there? NASA thought about this 10 years ago, and instead of building bigger dishes on rovers, they actually built a satellite communications network around another planet. And that's effectively what the Mars orbiter missions at the Red Planet do. In addition to their science, they have these giant fixed, transmitting antennas. They talk to the rovers when they fly overhead twice a day. They're so close, and they have special radio equipment. They transmit incredibly fast to each other. And then once they pass overhead, they retransmit that data back to Earth. So we use our satellite communication system as data relay, and we're able to enjoy the images, the science, and do all the complex planning that we need to do to have this unprecedented exploration of Mars.
Which is an incredible technological feat, by the way. I think that's something that often gets underscored when we're talking about the infrastructure that we've built up. We built a communications infrastructure on another planet.
Right.
That's something that we barely talk about. We often talk about, like you said, Curiosity and sort of the some of the exciting stuff, retrograde thrusters on a SUV size robot, right? Things like that. But the fact that we built up an entire infrastructure surrounding another planet over the last 25 years, it's incredible.
Absolutely. It's astounding. It literally is an incredible thing. It is unprecedented in human history, right? Aren't we fortunate that of all the 200,000 years Homo sapiens have been around on this planet, all of us have been here for the few decades that, we've managed to create exactly what you're saying, a satellite comm system on another planet because it's way more convenient that way for us. And we can do that.
It's the easier solution.
It's just the easy way. We took the easy way out is what you're saying.
I want my giant deployable antennas.
Welcome to technology, Jack. Yeah. That's what we do.
I want my uranium-fueled Curiosity rover. Come on, give it to me.
Right.
Beaming signals back there.
Right? We built that. And so we built all of that when Mars exploration was a higher priority at NASA, and all of those missions that we have 2 primary relay satellites at Mars right now: Mars Odyssey and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. We have a third orbiter called MAVEN that NASA runs. It's not in a great orbit, so it's kind of there as a backup. But MRO, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, is the prime data relay for Curiosity. That was built, that launched in 2005, designed to last 5 years. So the warranty expired in 2010. We have Mars Odyssey. Its warranty expired in 2003, and it's still up there operating. And so both of our critical data relay infrastructure satellites are both over a decade old, operating way beyond their intended design lifetime, and there is nothing in the pipeline to go replace them. That's the fundamental point of this paper, to bring it back to that paper. We looked at this. Why is there Mars exploration program? We have a program for robotically exploring Mars. That program has exactly 1 mission that it is currently building. That doesn't sound like a program to me. That doesn't sound like they know where they're going beyond this. That doesn't sound like we have buy-in. And because you've talked about before, space is hard. It takes a long time to build spacecraft. Every spacecraft pretty much is a boutique handmade item, particularly science spacecraft, right? So it takes roughly 3 to 5 years to build a new orbiter. You can only launch to Mars every 26 months. So you got to have it done in time for a launch window. And you start doing the math, you realize that we should have started working on the next Mars orbiter about a year ago in order to make sure that we have a reliable communications infrastructure at Mars next decade. Right now, we have not started one, and that was the impetus of the paper to say, we should be aware that we are doing this, folks. Like, we are, through, as you said, through inaction and through basically 5 years of constant budget cuts to planetary science, they did not do the preventative maintenance work or infrastructure support that we needed to do. And now we're facing a potential crisis for the next decade of the Mars exploration program. That's not to mention actually following up on the main scientific goals of the program, which is Mars sample return, which we are building. The one mission we are building will take the first step in that. The Mars 2020 rover will collect samples of Mars to eventually return to the Earth. But we have not committed to, designed, planned, or budgeted for any missions to bring them back. And so why are we doing this? Why are we about to spend $2.5 billion on this Mars 2020 rover with literally no approved follow-on missions to follow on to its primary mission, which was designed to be followed on by, right? So that's why I wrote the paper. And fortunately, we've seen very positive response to it when we've taken it around Congress, that this is an issue that we need to deal with now, that NASA needs to prioritize, and that is, as we pointed out, is not a controversial commitment to have a comm system at Mars to support our ongoing exploration and support the ongoing investment of the taxpayer who paid for all this. So
do you think it's a problem in it not being highlighted? Do you think that's sort of the overall issue? I'm sure folks within NASA have been wanting this and maybe have been crying out for this, but perhaps it not being highlighted to Congress, or perhaps even with the beginning of the new National Space Council, there's just something that we haven't addressed yet at that level, at the program of record level.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and it's always, you bring up a good point. We always have to be careful to describe NASA as some monolithic institution that does or that has desires and needs and wants. I think obviously at the Mars exploration program level in NASA, they've been raising the alarm for this. Jim Watson, the director of that program, said last year was the time to start that mission. They couldn't guarantee it would be ready for 2022. Why that has not made a bigger splash, I think part of this is that actually NASA, it's just terrible timing, honestly, that this has really come to a head during the presidential transition period and during the longest amount of uncertainty in NASA leadership ever, basically.
Right. Usually with most agencies, when presidential administrations are transitioning, there's tons of uncertainty. Programs typically don't get started. I mean, we've had at my old company, we had entire conversations about this. For instance, with DARPA, just stating that, hey, between the presidential election and the first 6 or 7 months of 2017, just expect very little to no programs to come out. And I'd have to imagine, it's the same for NASA and other organizations. Everyone's likely had that discussion. But yeah, you're right. It's bad timing because physically speaking, we need to build this thing and launch it soon.
The orbits of Mars... The orbits of Mars don't wait for politics, right? The Mars is going to become at opposition in 2022, whether or not NASA decides now whether it has political support to have a mission, right? And that's the tough part. So sorry, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, and I guess all these problems compound with the fact that this administration is so unpopular amongst both parties in Congress. I mean, it's a Republican administration. There are things that they agree on and work on together with the Republican administration, working with the Republican Congress. But in terms of space exploration initiatives, it seems that there's a I guess whatever the opposite of a confluence is of values and goals. I mean, we saw the NASA Reauthorization Act of 2017 came out and passed pretty quickly and was signed by the president. National Space Council comes out, but they've sort of already stalled on the budget, and they've stalled on whatever the next iteration of the authorization is going to be. I mean, there's already been talk both on Capitol Hill and within folks closer to the administration that they're already thinking about doing another reauthorization in 2018, which is beyond abnormal, considering the fact that the last time before 2017, the last time there was an authorization was 2010. And before that, it was 2005. This isn't something that happens on a yearly basis. But with the way that this administration is both perceived and is acting on its priority policy points, has made it difficult to address some of these key problems, and especially key long-term problems that we might not see the repercussions of until 2022 or 2030 even.
I see less so than the public support issue. To me, it comes down to more on just the uncertainty issue, which is kind of what you were touching on. Yeah, well, I mean, I think of it this way: the president, when you have a new administration come in, you have usually a mass resignation of all the previous agency administrators or secretaries, right? Because they served the past administration. They're political appointees. They're meant to reflect at some level the priorities of the current political structure in the White House. That's the right. They're all executive branch agencies. They have the right and duty, and honestly, it probably should work that way, right? So when you don't have even a nominee to serve as NASA administrator, if you are Robert Lightfoot, the acting administrator, you don't feel empowered by any political system to say, I need to be making new program decisions, because you're not empowered, right? By default, you are filling the chair until the White House nominates their person to lead that agency. And you have situations then where you're stuck in, you basically say, we'll just keep the lights on, we'll keep things running until we hear otherwise. The problem is that the Mars orbiter need for your telecom stuff should have been and was not solved in the last NASA leadership, and now kind of sits as something to figure out. But again, there's no empowered political structure at NASA to make that decision, to commit to it, which I don't think I would even say it's not even I'd say they're well within their supportive rights to do it, but I think that's part of it. And the issue is that I think we have an unusually long absence of a NASA administrator being named to lead the agency, and not even just the administrator. I mean, it took a while to get Charlie Bolden in under Obama, but you had Lori Garver coming in as a deputy administrator very early on, kind of running things. I had some sort of White House implicit support in the decision processes that they're making. And we don't have any of that. We don't have a deputy. We don't have an administrator. We don't have a chief financial officer. None of those have even been nominated, much less voted on by the Senate. And so NASA leadership is stunted, is just not existent to make these decisions. Then at the same time, I think you have, as you pointed out, these broader issues with budgetary conflicts within that are exposing some very deep divisions, ideological divisions within the current Republican Party that holds, honestly, a relatively narrow majority, particularly in the Senate. And so whether or not you get a Mars orbiter is not going to be the deciding factor of if we pass a budget this year, right?
Right.
It just becomes a victim, and there are probably thousands of projects like this that should be moving forward, but are stuck in this weird state of limbo. And so the White House can help by nominating an administrator, I think would be a big part of it. I think NASA could help itself by just proposing to do the mission and to empower the Mars program, because the great thing about the Mars program is I think that is really, it's small enough and it's been universal enough through administrations that it's not a controversial political thing. The interesting thing is, I was researching this paper, the Mars exploration program as a whole, this was conceived of in 2000, in the year 2000, and NASA committed to doing 5 missions in the next decade to Mars. Basically, a mission every single Mars launch opportunity every 26 months. They proposed to do that. They would figure out where the money would come from, but they would have an agency-wide decadal commitment to Mars. That was announced in the fall of 2000, in literally the last few months of Bill Clinton's presidency. And they didn't know who was going to be president. George W. Bush won. Lo and behold, ton of money flowed into Mars. They picked up the program and ran with it. So to say that you can't do these things in a transition it's not impossible, because that's how the Mars program came to be in the first place. I think it more is a function of how much risk do you want to take setting up the program, and how much buy-in do you think you can get. I think you can get a lot of buy-in for this.
It's risky, because you're talking about people setting up the programs and even vying to start studying these programs at the program manager level, the mid to upper level administration within NASA, and who's going to want to start a new program for a NASA or for a new NASA orbiter or a new NASA rover? You may get the orbiter to state that it's high likelihood that we're going to have to do this to keep up the infrastructure, but something like a rover, even a rover, may be risky, because the priorities of the new administration could be more moon-based. And they'll want to invest in programs like that. So from that sort of mid to upper level, it's just hard. It would without some sense of the direction of where NASA is going, it's just too difficult and too risky to start launching new programs.
I think that's definitely part of the thinking that's making this difficult. And so let me say a piece of good news though. Because I feel, just in case your listeners are worried that this is all hopeless, what we've done with this paper has been, I remember talking to someone early on in my career, and I forget what the issue was. They're saying, why didn't people take action, to do something? It's like, well, we needed to put a report together first. I said, really? It's like, yeah, you just never underestimate the power of a report. It's just true. Like it's a lot easier. You walk into a congressional office and you put down a report, say, here's all the information. Let me summarize it for you. But here's all, there's some power of just coalescing all this information together. And once we had the report, we met with a lot of congressional offices to share this. The most relevant ones in the Science Committee in the House and Senate, and also the Budget, the Appropriations Committees. And Democrat or Republican, generally, we've had a really positive response along the lines of, gee, are we really letting this happen? Like, this seems crazy. This seems really easy to fix. And that's great. That's the kind of response that we want. And we have had, so far, the Senate and the House have both put forward appropriations bills for NASA for 2018. And both of them have added money to the Mars exploration program, both of them. So we think that that's a huge step in the right direction. The House had additional language saying, you shall build a Mars orbiter by 2022. Here's $62 million extra to do that. That is about as good as you get. I can't find a much better endorsement than that. The Senate,
I think under success in the dictionary, you see a graphic that shows this.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Precisely, right? Like that, I saw that and I was like, okay, well, I guess I could retire now. I don't, I guess that's it. But no,
your work is done.
Yeah, if only. But that was a great piece of language, and exactly, we had recommended 75 total. 55 added to start work on the Mars orbiter, which is roughly what you need this year to have an orbiter ready by 2022. That's kind of a mid-sized orbiter mission. And then another 20 million set aside for advanced work on developing the Mars ascent vehicle that you would need to return samples from Mars. You need a rocket that can launch by itself on Mars with no maintenance, nothing go wrong, minimal moving parts, and it be tiny and you can land and carry it around and so forth. So they didn't mention the MAV, but they mentioned the orbiter. Great. We had the Senate bill. The Senate is kind of funny. They didn't say anything about Mars, but they added $75 million to the Mars exploration program budget. And the way that we interpret that is basically they added the money and are giving NASA maximum. There's literally nothing else you can really spend it on that much all of a sudden beyond a new orbiter and the tech development. So we saw that as giving NASA more flexibility. They gave them the money with lots of flexibility. The House gave them the money with very clear direction on how NASA should spend it. So point is, we have two budgets moving through the House and the Senate. Long way to get to before those are passed, but both of them have extra money for Mars. And you get something in at an early stage like this, you have a much higher chance that it rides through towards the end. So we see that as a very promising step.
Good news.
Yeah, and this is your Planetary Society membership dues at work. Honestly, this is the kind of stuff that we do. This has been our prime focus, and we've done something on the order of 45 congressional meetings in different offices in the last couple months about this issue. We've been hammering this issue, and I think we've made a difference here. And so that we're in the right direction. NASA itself has announced that they will, and it's not clear exactly what they're going to announce or not, but they're going to be talking about some next steps or future of the Mars program here at the end of August. We're looking forward to that. I know that there's some ideas floating around for how to address the fundamental questions of Mars sample return, which again is, well, I should emphasize, is the top scientific priority of the Mars science community and of the planetary science community of this decade, for the decadal review, the decadal report that they put together for priorities in planetary science. So this is not even just like a pet project. This is the top scientific program as decided by scientists.
Yeah, and the meeting that you're describing is the one on August 28th through the 30th in Massachusetts. The National Academy of Sciences is putting together this review of progress towards implementing the decadal survey vision and voyages for planetary sciences. A bit of a mouthful, but so we're seeing here on the House side and the Senate side movement towards passing a budget that has money for the Mars exploration program. And you're seeing the scientific community getting together to discuss the future of the program.
Yeah, well, and do you know why they're doing that report right now? That's our old friend, the 2017 NASA authorization bill actually called for that. So if they didn't do it, they would be breaking the law. And someone, I don't know who enforces NASA authorization bills, but the enforcement mechanism, some big guys would kick the door down.
I think it's just Scott Pace with a baseball bat.
Bunch of jackbooted thugs walking into scientist's office, making them right.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm telling you, it's just Scott Pace with a baseball bat.
Scott Pace doesn't need a baseball bat. He just needs to give you a stern look. And I think that's pretty intimidating, honestly, from what I've understood. But that's actually in the NASA authorization bill. They put in, like, within 180 days of this report or something like that, the becoming law, NASA shall update Congress on the status of its Mars program. It was some Congressees, but it was included in there. We're happy to see it. And again, I think that helped spur NASA a little bit to really be thinking about, what are we doing with our Mars program? Why do we have it? What's the goal? And if we choose, if we say we want to continue doing it, we should probably actually make some decisions to demonstrate that we will actually continue to do it, or tell the largest kind of subset of planetary scientists, the Mars scientists in the country, to go find other jobs. Because all of these missions that we have to Mars right now, again, they're all beyond their intended design lifetimes. We don't want the 2020s to be a decade where we watch our investments at Mars die one by one, right? We want the decade of the 2020s to be where we continue to push the capabilities, human capabilities for technology, for robotics, and for scientific exploration at the Red Planet. And you do that by Mars sample return. And you do that first by having the infrastructure to even talk to your rovers on the ground.
And then that just builds up the infrastructure more for humans to orbit Mars, I think, is the other proposal from the Society.
Yeah, that was our look at finding a way. How can you do kind of touches on a lot of issues we just talked about. How do you build a coalition of people How do you approach a problem that is inherently requires a lot of upfront cost and requires a bunch of invested political and private and geographical locations, basically NASA and aerospace industry. And we looked at one way you could get people to Mars by the 2030s, starting with 2033, is you build a program that's not just the boots footprints on Mars and you end it, but you build a large, sustained and sustainable program that has, as a component of it, a first mission where you orbit people around Mars, just like you had Apollo 8 or Apollo 11, to be honest, or sorry, 10, Apollo 10. And then you follow up with continued ongoing human presence on the surface. That was the Humans Orbiting Mars report that came out in 2015. And we had it independently costed by Aerospace Industry Corporation and saw it could fit within a human spaceflight budget that increased with inflation plus 2%, which is very doable. And that doesn't you could phase it in. A required component is that the International Space Station has to end by 2028 at the latest. Be a lot easier if it ended, or at least the monetary requirements for the U.S. ended in 2024. And then you put that money toward the first step actually would be a cislunar station, which is kind of where we're going right now. And beyond that, you got to start investing in your long-term life support, your communications infrastructure at Mars. I think in the movie The Martian, if people remember, there's like an offhand remark in that they had one of their 12 or something orbiting satellites had to be moved to focus on Mark Watney. And I remember hearing that and just like wiping the drool away from my mouth, like, oh my God, 12 orbiters, that's so much communications. So you would need more with humans.
Imagine the bandwidth.
Oh yeah, they're probably all laser comms too. That's the other thing. We can upgrade to laser communications and have an open fiber optic tether of data to Mars effectively versus X-band or K-band, whatever K-band I guess we're using now. And yeah, and it would just give us so much more data. And you'll need more. For humans, we generate a lot more data than robots do and need a lot more data. So it would be really critical for that. So the humans orbiting Mars is a clear, very practical, I think, pathway to move forward. I think we're already behind on that in terms of having to embrace that and move aggressively forward. It was even more basically saying, if NASA is serious about sending humans to Mars, we need to have some outline and timeline so we have a hope of establishing any sort of baseline to evaluate, are we making good progress towards that goal or not? That was the problem with NASA's journey to Mars. It's like, great, we're going. How do we know if we're on schedule? Did we get enough money this year? Did we have to delay something? What's our milestones? And we didn't have any, and honestly, we still don't. And so, trying to have some sort of structure by which to evaluate progress.
Some metrics for success.
Yeah, exactly. You learn that in like business school 101 or any project management, right? You can't
That's like government program manager like lingo. It's what are your metrics for success?
Sure. Yeah. You can't have any project where you just get a group of people together and say, hey guys, we intend to have a house built, like an Amish barn raising. You get a bunch of people together and say, all right, guys, we want to have a barn up by, let's say, the end of next month. And people go, oh, great, what are we going to do? It's like, let's just hang out and think about this for a while, but it'll be in the future. We'll have a barn. And that's like people looking around saying, okay, I'm glad you want to build a barn, but it sounds like you probably should be doing something. It's like, no, we're on track. It's like, okay, how do you do it? Whatever. And there's no way to
I have seen proposals. Now, I have seen proposals like that in the government. Those programs usually don't get off the ground, but
they tend not to be too successful in the end. Shit like that.
Like literally, they don't get off the ground.
Yes, in this case, precisely. So that was the human Mars question has an entirely different set of problems beyond the robotic Mars program. I think, and the interesting thing is, I wonder, honestly, in some ways, if the robotic Mars program is getting lumped in with the human Mars program in the current NASA or White House thinking of whether to focus on that or not going forward. because they have overlaps, but they're distinct in the sense that the robotic Mars program exists and is at Mars, right? It has that distinct advantage and clarity, and has been to Mars and has landed on Mars and hasn't had a mission failure in almost 20 years now. And there's an incredible capability we've built up, and the workforce that enables that in terms of software and hardware engineers, in terms of operators who, there's not that many people who have experience operating a spacecraft on another planet, and most of them work at JPL for the Mars program. You don't have follow-up missions. You don't have stuff for them to do, and not just bookkeeping stuff, but actually stuff that engages their talent. They'll go elsewhere, and we'll lose that 2 decades of investment into building this workforce behind the Mars program. The human Mars program it's such a bigger set of issues that you can see that it's like even agreeing on how to begin to pursue it has been too big of a hurdle to overcome even. And that's where we're stuck. And I think this is why you see a lot of people talking about the moon and making, they also, I think there's a lot of opportunistic, timing is right if you want to try to shift NASA's focus. But I like to point out that in either situation, you'll want a long-term, having a cislunar habitat where you can develop your long-term closed-loop life support and operations further away than low Earth orbit is going to be useful no matter where you end up going. And I think that's a really good first step. But again, we should probably commit to that, to doing that soon, because it takes a while to build these, right? And we haven't started on that yet.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant move on NASA's part to pitch that sort of cislunar orbiter that would create that sort of infrastructure. But yeah, we have to actually glob onto it and make it real and actually invest in it. So
right, because I think the same thing you see with ARM is if you talk about a project that doesn't have any actual money or people invested in it, it's really easy for those projects to go away. They're not built into your system. Good counterexample: Space Launch System. Whether you like it or whether you hate it and think it's a waste, it has a lot of people invested in it, and it spends money. It spends $2 billion a year all over the place. Therefore, it is a popular program, and it will survive this transition and will continue. And it always was kind of surprising to me to hear people think that it wouldn't, because again, it was so... It is very deeply baked into congressional thinking. And to change it, you had Obama came in and tried to end the equivalent of it, Constellation, and they ended up with a bigger rocket. When they tried to kill Constellation, they're like, damn it, now we have a bigger rocket. And they kept the Orion crew capsule. And it takes a lot of political effort. And that's where I think, honestly, the popularity of the administration and probably the administration's popularity among Congress is going to do it no favors in doing significant changes in space policy.
Yeah. So this is a hot button issue, I guess, if you could call it that, in the space world, an emerging issue that, I'm very thankful for this white paper and of the responses that Casey, that you've gotten, that Matt and Jason have gotten, and then even also when I'm on the ground talking to members and volunteers, the advocacy aspect of the society putting out papers like this, it not only engages our membership, but also really pushes us forward and keeps at least the society on the forefront of a lot of these issues. So if you want to be a part of this very awesome community, you can go to planetary.org/join. It's only $4 a month. That's my pitch.
Hey, that's a great pitch. I second that wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And you get an awesome t-shirt out of it. Like, come on. It's like the softest t-shirt you will ever wear.
That's true. Let's call it advanced space age fabrics that make it like that.
Yeah, it direct from sort of maybe not space, but we're in space now, right?
It's
we're just on a giant rock.
That's an accurate thing to say.
We're apart.
Anything made in the last 60 years is space age. So it's space age t-shirt fabrics.
Space age t-shirt fabrics. I like it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Casey, for taking us through Mars in retrograde, why Mars, humans orbiting Mars. It seems like we've talked about everything Mars today.
Yeah, thanks very much.
I appreciate that. I feel like we could go on for Mars for a good couple more hours. We barely touched on human stuff. And I didn't even talk about, we didn't even talk about planetary protection.
Mars. Which is a hot topic these days.
It seems like it's all anybody will message us about.
True.
They're hiring a new officer. Yeah, that's a whole other story we won't get into. But yeah, this is what I love about space policy. I know you love space, but both of you do. And it's such a rich field. And at its core, this is what keeps me sane, because at its core, it's such an expression fundamentally of optimism, of hope for the future, and really an expression of our better angels, of our human nature, to be arguing about, well, we better preserve that satellite infrastructure that we built on another planet, like, so we can keep answering fundamental science questions there. Like, that's, and people will say, well, that's a good point. Like, you realize people accept the fact that science is a good thing, that being on another planet is a good thing for us to do and should be invested in. And you don't have to make that argument. You just have to, we're trying to just increase the resources to pursue the capabilities that we have. And that's a really wonderful position to be in, enviable position in some ways as a policy person, to have such a positive area to work in, where even people you disagree with have different interests or different types of optimism, usually, in a way. So it's a really great field and just such amazing things to discuss. And that's why people should get more into space policy in general. Can I plug my show?
Literally
as well?
The future.
Yeah,
sure, absolutely. Plug away.
That's why we started so far it's monthly space policy podcast on Planetary Radio, which is at planetary.org/radio. And once the first Friday of every month, me and my colleague Jason Callahan, who you both know, and Matt Kaplan will discuss some space policy issue of the moment, go into significant depth usually, and really just have a good time doing it. And again, we could do those every week, but I have other things I need to do, like writing reports at the society. Yeah. so far we haven't. But
yeah, a weekly podcast is a bit difficult. Trust me.
Well, a wise man once told me reports are good.
Yes, this is a smart guy, and I think that's where you can hear more of this. And you guys talk about it a lot, which is great. It's just such a fun part of space to be involved in. To say how does the system work? How do we get from an idea to a piece of metal that will be going to another planet? Like, it takes a long time just to get to that point, and that's where a lot of the interesting stuff happens. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Casey.
Thank you for jumping on.
Anytime, guys.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, if you like this show, whether it's for the technology or the policy side, you need to be also listening to Planetary Radio every week.
Absolutely.
And especially the space policy editions. They will fill your head with wonderful, wonderful ideas about space policy. So we are sitting at about an hour and 14 minutes.
So
Newton,
I'm thinking we do a quick coming soon to space and talk about our live stream that's coming up next week.
I agree. For all of the other articles that we had mentioned earlier, as well as anything that's sort of going on right now that we have found in the last week, there will be links in the show notes. You can click on them there, read them there, and you can submit your questions to our Facebook page or Twitter and we will be doing a live stream on our way down to Nashville. So me and Newton, we're going down to Nashville for the total solar eclipse happening next Monday. It like literally 7 days away from right now, like in exactly 7 days
from when we're recording this.
Total, yes. From when we're recording this, we will have seen a total solar eclipse across the entire United States. The first time that has happened from coast to coast since 1918.
So yeah, in case you guys have been under a rock and not listened to our show, there's going to be a total solar eclipse that darkens the skies all the way from Oregon to South Carolina along a stretch of land about 70 miles wide. NASA has some great maps on their website. We can include that in the show notes of ideal places to be for that eclipse. Here in DC, I think they're going to get about 80% coverage, but where we're going in just outside of Nashville, we'll be able to see 100% darkness, 100% coverage of the eclipse. So make sure that you go outside at the time. That is on August 21st, and check it out. Other than that, Jack, you got any other announcements?
That's it. Yeah, I mean, tune in for our podcast live stream on Sunday. I'm assuming it's going to be a couple hours long since we will be driving. So send us your questions, your comments, your fun things for us to do on our 10 to 15 hour car ride, depending on traffic. So yeah, that's all I got. So yeah, again, I'd like to thank Casey Dreier from the Planetary Society for coming on and talking to us about all this wonderful Mars stuff. And yeah, I guess that's it. So as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.